a very unique brand in the United States. It's found in just about every bar. And when I went and talked to bartenders, I said, hey, do you carry Canadian Club? And they said, no. And then I looked behind them and I said, what about that bottle back there? And they said, oh yeah, and they dusted it off. The problem with Canadian Club is it's in every bar, but nobody's drinking it. And in the famous words of a consultant, it's everywhere, everyone knows it, but no one drinks it. That is wrong. So what we needed to do is we needed to fix that. Now the thing about Canadian Club that was very unique is there are a lot of whiskeys out there, but what makes Canadian Club special is that you can mix it. Mix it with different things, and it's a very good mixable whiskey. You don't typically drink it straight on the rocks. When we looked at the sales trends, we were confronted with a big problem. 15 years of declining sales. 15 years. Huge problem for Canadian Club. That's us. That's the creative team, and that's us thinking. So what we did was we said, okay, we got to get under the hood. We got to figure out what the problem is, but first we got to learn a little bit about the category. Okay, vodka, huge. A lot of people drink it. It's basically tasteless. It's a good way to get drunk. You can mix it with stuff. In essence, though, it's not masculine and it's not feminine. It's basically an alcohol with no genitals. Beer, it's another huge thing. Beer is a huge category dominant, but it's not very sophisticated. It doesn't carry the kind of sophistication that some of the hard spirits carry. So we learned a bit about our consumer, and we called him Uncommitted Joe. The reason we called him Uncommitted Joe is when Joe went to the bar to get a drink, he stood there and paused for a moment because he didn't know exactly what his drink of choice was. Certain instances, it was beer. Certain instances, he sort of looked around to see what everyone else was drinking, but he didn't have his drink of choice. He was willing to. Then the thing about Joe that you need to understand, because this is critically important to understanding why this campaign ended up the way it did. Joe's sort of in his early 30s, starting his career, you know, maybe starting to think about a family. He wasn't a frat boy. He wasn't straight out of college. He was starting to come into his own, you know, early 30s. And there were things that he was willing to do as a guy, to be a guy, and show that he was sophisticated, but it had its limits. Oh, hell no. That's what he said to that drink. I'm not drinking that. No way. Because when he said, what about cocktails? Would you drink cocktails, Joe? No, because of that. But I said, why? How did this happen? How did this become what cocktails are? I'll tell you how. It's sad. It really is sad. Because when we talked to these guys, they said, yeah, I'd like to drink cocktails, but I don't like the flamingos and the umbrellas and shit hanging out of my drink. That's not very cool. So I went into the bars and I talked to them. Now this is where I come into the point where asking simple questions. I went in with 5 questions. 5 questions. That was my qualitative research. I did ethnographic research in bars. And I sat at the bar and I had an empty seat next to me. And I grabbed the guy and I said, can you sit down here? And he said, sure. And I had a bartender make it Cosmopolitan, that pink drink you just saw. And I handed it to the guy and I said, I'd like to ask you some questions. And he started to get very nervous. So I asked him a question, and the first thing he did was go to put that drink on the bar. I said, no, you got to hold that. He started to sweat. He was looking around to see if his buddies were watching. It was a very uncomfortable situation. That is where we found our small idea. Because what we realized was that for Joe, he didn't mind drinking cocktails. It was what it symbolized. He didn't like what it said about him. He didn't want to be holding a pink drink. Now, why didn't he want to be holding a pink drink? What caused this? There was something at the root of this. And it's one person who caused all of this problem. Her. She is evil. For all men, she killed cocktails. Her and her friends. Drinking pink drinks. It's terrible. Guys could no longer drink cocktails because of them. But it wasn't always like this. There was a point in time when cocktails were cool for guys. The Rat Pack and Frank Sinatra, and guys drank cocktails out of whiskey, out of the rocks glasses. It was sophisticated. It was masculine. It was definitely not pink drinks. This is what we wanted to tap into. The strategy was very simple. Simple idea. Canadian Club was going to put masculinity back into cocktails. That was the idea. Canadian Club was putting masculinity back into cocktails. Forget about the pink drinks. Forget about the feminine cocktail. Cocktails are reborn and they're masculine again. A word about the creative brief. That was the brief. In less than 30 words, I summed up the entire strategy for them. 30 words. Putting masculinity back into cocktails. And if you want to see hear what it says, get sociable and unpretentious guys who'd like to enjoy cocktails that aren't feminine to make Canadian Club their go-to drink by convincing them that we put masculinity back into cocktails. That was it. That's what the creatives had. They didn't get a long brief. It was that. There was one time I went to Germany because we were having an issue with aspirin. And I said to the account person, I said, can I see the brief that was issued? And I kid you not, she handed me a piece of paper that was this big. It was literally this big. And they all laughed and they said, oh my God, this is really funny. And I said, I handed them a piece of paper that was this big. And I said, this is your brief. Not this, this. Okay, so the work. It all comes down to that, right? It's like the strategy can be great. But the true test of it was it simple enough to create a great campaign? And this, without further ado, actually, let me give a little preface. What we tapped into with Canadian Club was its heritage. We realized, you know, going back to that whole Rat Pack thing, there's actually a person who symbolizes who symbolizes that era, the time when cocktails were actually cool. And it was your dad, your father. Believe it or not, your father was cool at one point. Not the fat guy who's running around the house in his underwear right now. But the cool guy, the guy who was in his early 30s, went out and got laid. You know, it was like, I know we don't think about our parents that way, but what we realized is we started looking through scrapbooks and we're like, holy shit, our father was cool. Wow, that's really interesting. So we tapped into that and we said, if we're bringing masculinity back to cocktails, who better to sort of lead the revival than Dad? And that was the first idea. Your mom was not your dad's first. And they said, oh my God. What it says here, I'll read it to you. It says, he went out, he got 2 numbers in a night. He drank cocktails, but they were whiskey cocktails, made with Canadian Club, served in a rocks glass. They tasted good, they were effortless. Damn right your dad drank it. And that was the rallying cry. Your dad had groupies.